threshold or you're courageous. Last time we made it to about the year 1600, if I'm right. We think we spent an hour on the 1500s. Did I miss anything you're interested in? I think we kind of left off with the destruction of the Armada and Queen Elizabeth coming onto the throne, and a couple other developments in Spain. And so there's obviously like a lot of micro history that's going on, and I'm probably missing some of the things that are more interesting, but trying to get us through with a little bit of understanding. So I did talk about the Puritans making their way over to the Americas, right? And how they did that because they were exiled. They were not happy with what we called the Elizabethan settlement, which we often call the middle way now between Roman Catholicism and low Protestantism. That still is our tradition. And so if you are really bored in a service and you'd like to know what that looked like, you can turn to the back of the prayer book where there are historical documents and read the 39 Articles. The 39 Articles are sort of like the Elizabethan compromise between Catholicism and Protestant theology, and you'll find some interesting things. And curiously enough, I've had emails where people said, you said X in the sermon, but the 39 Articles say Y. And my reply is like, no one's read those for 300 years. So just keep in mind, they're a historical document. They're not meant to be a hysterical document, although you can easily get hysterical over them because they do have things in them like the doctrine of election, right? Which is not really a thing. So I think I left off, I mentioned to you Calvin in Geneva and him running the place, frankly, like a military barracks. But maybe you've heard of this little acronym TULIP. Calvin didn't use it himself, but it is an interesting bit, particularly because the P was not unique to Calvin. Luther used this as well, and so did the Roman Catholics. P stands for perseverance of the saints, which means if you're elect or if you're chosen by God, or you'd like to be chosen by God, if you don't believe in predestination, saints persevere. So the doctrine of election, if you're a Calvinist and you say, well, God has elected me, that doesn't get you off the hook of good works, which is interesting, because Luther's whole concern was it's all by faith, not by works, but Luther believed in the perseverance of the saints as well. I, in case you're wondering, stands for irresistible grace, which means if God calls you, you can't even say no. And the converse would be irresistible damnation, to be honest, which is if you want to be saved and God doesn't pick you, too bad. Really kind of strange to think about that. T stands for total depravity, which means there is nothing good in us. Now, I did not do this with you, but this idea of total depravity is not unique to John Calvin. It sort of had been building over the last 200 or 300 years in various theologians, but it is not original to either Judaism or Christianity. We sort of see, I had a professor who did this in seminary, who tracked the libretto, those are the words of hymns, and concepts of total depravity don't show up till the 1300s. Like, we're nothing, we're bad, we're filthy rags, our righteousness is awful. 1200s. Maybe you're wondering why. There's not a one-to-one correlation, but of course, Dante Alighieri, the poet who takes Virgil through the Inferno and then into paradise, his work obviously came out at the end of the 10th, into the 11th century, into the 12th, and so it is possible that Dante's view of hell, quite honestly, pushes towards total depravity. I didn't really know what to say about it, except I grew up in churches that stressed there's no good in us, and that's this, but it's not original to Christianity. And as I mentioned, it's not original to Judaism either. Judaism theology is human beings are created not even neutral. We're not blank slates. We're created good.
Where do the Catholics, and I'm thinking because I was in Catholic school for a long time, And I don't remember real clearly if the nuns were teaching total depravity or not.
Well, it comes out of the Augustinian tradition. I'm not blaming Saint Augustine, right? But if you're born with original sin,
Yeah.
well, there it is. You're a sinner. And it is still the case. If you don't get baptized to remove your original sin, you'll go to hell when you die, which is why if you go to the NICU and it's a Catholic family and the baby's like, it's really important you baptize that baby.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like in the NICU.
Mm.
And if the baby dies, they still want the baby baptized. And you can understand what they're afraid of, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And really growing up Hispanic, there was even stronger feelings about that.
Yeah.
The fact that the baby had to be baptized. And,
Yeah, no, if the baby's healthy, fine, we can wait and do it in church, right? But if we've got the remotest concern, the priest gets called.
Yeah.
And the priest will hightail it. This is because the priests believe that too. I don't, but I just have to be really clear, like I don't.
I used to think, but I don't know, maybe it's just thinking as a young woman. I think the priests do that because they know that the people, it would displease the people in the
There's a
church.
pastoral reason, but there's also a theological reason. I mean, that is Gaudium et Spes, like that is the doctrine of the Catholic Church.
Okay.
So if you're going to be a priest in the Catholic Church, like maybe you don't believe that doctrine, but you've taken vows, you're going to uphold it. Yeah.
So when you say that it's not original to Judaism, or does that mean that you can track it back like 2000 BCE or something?
This idea about total depravity, no, it's not that old. It tracks back to Neoplatonism, which wasn't even around when the New Testament was written. I mean, that really shows up like in the 200s, 300s. And what do you know? St. Augustine was a Neoplatonist. And the idea, right, just to be really clear, the idea is that body is a bad lesser prison for good eternal spirit. By the way, the New Testament scriptures are really clear that isn't so, because Paul stresses both the Thessalonians and the Corinthians that the resurrection is of the body or nothing, which is Paul trying to say, I think, body good, body not bad. So it's very strange that people who read Paul, and because Paul does do this other thing where he talks about being in the flesh or being in the spirit, right? So I don't think Paul is saying our flesh is bad when he insists that there's a bodily resurrection or our faith is useless, which he does, right? In both Thessalonians and Corinthians 15. So this tea thing is very odd. Like, did you ever hear that Adam and Eve ate the fruit and there was a fall? Yeah, no Jewish person believes there's a fall because there's not. There's no fall. They just can't live in the garden. So we've invented this whole doctrine of a fall because it's Platonic, not because it's Jewish or faithful. A fall. Well, human beings we were going to live forever, but then they ate the fruit. No, you only live forever when you eat that fruit that gives you life. Like human beings are made out of dirt. Like this is a basic read of the scriptures. Oh, well, everybody was peaceful in the garden till the people ate the fruit. So the saber-toothed tiger ate what? Melons? I mean, it's just ridiculous, right? It's like this is ridiculous Christian fiction. And I don't understand it, right? The vision is not that there was no violence, it's that in God's kingdom there won't be any. The wolf will lie down with the lamb, not because they used to, but because that's what reconciliation will be like. So this is strange, but I would tell you most Christian people today, even if they say they don't believe it, they do. Total depravity. There's no good in us. Evidence, the prayer of humble access, which if you are a longtime Episcopalian, and you may love it, it's just the theology is terrible. We're not worthy to eat the crumbs under your table. Well, except that God made you worthy. Like that happened earlier in the service. You were made worthy. So it's this weird self-deprecation thing that we do. And by all means, do it on your southern porch with your sweet tea, because that's what Southerners do. But don't call it worship, because it's not.
Is your objection to that, the timing of where it is in the service? or-
Absolutely, that's my objection.
Yeah.
Because it's wrong. Do that and then do the confession and then get absolved and say, thanks be to God, now we've been made worthy.
So I'm one of the people that have always loved the
Yeah.
prayerful access, but
It's just the timing.
Yeah.
The prayer is a great communication of how we feel. We feel not worthy, but it's not true. Yeah, so again, I've done it before in Lent and we did it right off the bat. It was the first
Yeah.
thing we did when we came
yeah,
to the
I
church.
know, I think we actually had conversations about that.
Yeah, again, it's not that I hate the prayer, it's that sometimes we mistake a prayer for something that's true instead of for a reflection of how we feel.
What exactly, we don't know what you're talking about.
There's a prayer in Write One prayer book called the Prayer of Humble Access. It's optional, even in the prayer book, it says this may be prayed, and the words are something like, Tim probably knows them better than I do.
You started, I could probably recite.
We're not worthy to pick up the crumbs.
Pick up the crumbs under thy table, but thou art, oh gosh, it's been a while.
We're not worthy.
Yeah.
We're so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll tell you, we're in Advent, right? We've been using Write One Prayer 1, which is the most antiquated language of anything in the prayer book. We talk about Jesus being an oblation and a satisfaction. And I mean, I did it to expose us to the prayer book, but I hate that prayer because we keep asking for forgiveness of sins in the prayer, and that already happened in the service. So I don't think I'll use it again for some time. I mean, I'm only using it because it's in the prayer book and it's part of our tradition, but I don't like it.
Was there a time when the Catholic Church believed in that really, or does it?
Total depravity? Oh, they still do. If you
They
don't get
still do.
baptized, you're going to hell.
Yeah, oh, yeah, well.
That's
I
total
mean,
depravity.
That's how I grew up.
Well, that's how we all grew up. If you grew up Southern Baptist, you grew up with total depravity. I'm telling you right now, you did. If you grew up Presbyterian, you grew up with total depravity. If you grew up Jewish, you didn't. But you grew up with Jewish guilt, which might be worse. Like, I don't know the answer to that. But that's not Jewish theology, that's Jewish social pressure. Those are different things. U stands for unconditional salvation. So if God calls you, that's for good. And L stands for the big one, limited atonement. So not everybody gets called.
That's kind of depressing.
Now, you can see, I mean, Calvin was a bright guy. He was a bright guy and he was probably well-intentioned. As I mentioned last time, Protestant work ethic comes from Calvin, and Calvin did this thing that we don't think is really great. There was a guy in Geneva called Michael Servetus who was not a 5-point Calvinist and did not subscribe to this. And he was preaching things that John Calvin didn't agree with. And so he ended up being tried for heresy and burned at the stake. And John Calvin allowed that to happen. So this is a major Protestant concern too. The Catholics come off rough for the Inquisition, and they should. But it's also important that Protestants do this too, right? Burning a heretic is a line once crossed. How do you get on the other side of that? I mean, that's tough business. And so I just want to name that about our good brother John Calvin. Okay, so now we're into the 1600s. And what do you know? I'm going to talk a little bit about our church tradition a little bit.
Hey, Mike,
Yeah, please.
we talked about the Protestant Reformation, but I just want to take you a little back a little bit further. We went to the Egyptian.
Oh, yeah, the
Church,
Coptic Orthodox, yeah.
and they are not part of the Catholic tradition, right?
Nope, they got cut out in the Council of Toledo 542 because they're Monophysite heretics.
Okay.
They believe in one nature of Jesus, not two.
Okay.
Same with the Ethiopic Orthodox Church, Monophysites. Now, they wouldn't say they're Monophysites. That's what the Council of Toledo said. Yeah, so the cut goes pretty far back. Yeah. Okay, so in England, there's this problem with the Puritans, and the Puritans didn't all go to America, and they're rallying, particularly because there's a new king on the throne. Many of you know Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, lived a really long time, and that really helps make policy when you live a long time and you can kind of enforce it and normalize it. But when Elizabeth died, being the Virgin Queen and all, she didn't have an heir. So this is when the Stuarts came to the throne. And Stuarts came from good Catholic heritage. James the First being the first one on the Stuart throne. And James did do a rather interesting project that you probably know. He authorized a translation of the Bible into the vernacular that we now call the King James Bible. 1611. Now, did James do any of the work? Pretty much no. He was a king, right? He had scholars, and they did do something rather lovely. They consulted the oldest Greek and Hebrew manuscripts they could find when translating into English. So they not only went from the Vulgate, they did a rather ecumenical and interfaith effort. The manuscripts, the oldest ones they could find, were about 20 years old. Which is not very old. I just want to be really clear. And King James also did some very interesting things. Even though he was translating from Greek and Hebrew into English, the vernacular, there were moments in which he said, or his scholars said, there's this really funny word that means John the Immerser fully dunked people under the water. That sounds dangerous for babies. What if we just left it as John the Baptist? Because the way they were baptizing is by sprinkling. So that's what happened. So it was a partial translation of the vernacular, because it turns out the word Baptist in Greek means dunker or immerser, like you dyed fabric by fully immersing. By the way, this was ammunition for the Anabaptists who said you had to be immersed and as an adult. But just so you know, King James was a bit disingenuous with his translation because he didn't call him John the Dunker. Now, we have to, think through this. And look, I'll tell you, I grew up in a liberal branch of the Church of Christ because we had a piano. And so what we decided was, hey, when you sprinkle a baby, that sprinkling, it's not baptism. It's not valid or real because they weren't dunked and they weren't adults. Now, I was an adult at the age of 10. Go figure that. I mean, we were really having our cake and eating it too, right? But there became this sort of mistrust about, is baptism valid if somebody's not immersed in the water or not? And by the way, that's a long one because the Anabaptists wanted to take the Bible so literally that maybe they didn't take it seriously. And beyond that, like, theology had changed since Augustine. People wanted their infants sprinkled so they wouldn't go to hell, right? I mean, so this is going on even in the King James Bible. And this is what makes it so interesting when you meet people who say that the King James Bible is the word of God, and God speaks King James English. And you may say that's ridiculous. Nobody thinks that. There's plenty of people that think that. And it's riddled with errors. I mean, riddled with errors, the King James Bible, not just this particular word about baptism, but as I mentioned, it's got some very, very new manuscripts. I mean, we found the Dead Sea Scrolls 70 years ago, and they've got documents in there that are from 400 BCE. So that's 1,600 years prior to the manuscripts that were used in the King James translation. Why is older better? Well, it's been less edited and it's closer to the source, right? This is why we'd rather have, older manuscripts. Does it change the meaning a lot? It turns out it doesn't. It turns out not a lot. But when you say the scripture is your sole source of tradition, you really probably want the best one you can get, right? So just a word about the King James Bible. But again, for its day, he tried. King James sat on the throne okay. He was a Catholic and everybody knew it, but he wasn't trying to change Elizabeth's settlement. The problem, of course, came with his son, Charles, who was a little too Catholic. And what do you know? He lost his head for that, right? Parliament tried him for treason, tried the king for treason, try to follow that argument out to its logical conclusion. It's a little difficult. And I mean, how does the king commit treason against himself? And so he lost his head. And this is when Thomas Cromwell's grandson, one Oliver Cromwell, became Lord Protector of England. And he was a low Protestant, so tried to sweep out the Elizabethan reforms once again, right? Consider how quickly pages get turned, right? And it turns out that Oliver Cromwell was also a bit like Napoleon. He was a fantastic field commander. I mean, he knew how to move an army around, that's for sure. And he had the New Model Army, which essentially not only took England, but went over and subjugated the Irish, they being Catholic and all, and committed really, I mean, really like war crimes. There's just no better word than that. This was an extremely uncomfortable time. And as again, like they went through this difficult time with Mary, and then Elizabeth was the restoration. And that was great if you were an Anglican, but if you were a Catholic, Elizabeth was like the devil. And now you get taken one turn worse. You got hopeful Charles was going to help you, but now it's even worse. And if you're Anglican or if you're Catholic, Cromwell's not who you want because he's a low Protestant. And hey, when the army fell apart, then they had this other problem. What are we going to do? And they put Charles II on the throne. But he wasn't that great either. So then William and Mary came over, right? That was the Orange Revolution and the peaceful one. William of Orange was not related to the monarchy, it was Mary, right? So that catches us up a little bit with what's happening dynastically. Meanwhile, there's these, the Puritans got some royal endorsement under Cromwell because he was a Puritan, he was a low Protestant. So people had to defend Anglican theology, and the most famous one, you may not know his name, is Richard Hooker, who in writing about defense, about how church decisions ought to be made and church ought to be governed, he's the one who came up with the three-legged stool. That is that our sources are scripture, but also tradition and reason. So Hooker is the one who laid this down in a document, and since Hooker in the mid-1600s, this has been the Anglican and Episcopal position, is that we don't use scripture alone, we use scripture in conversation with tradition and reason.
I've always heard that Hooker was the founder of Anglican theology. I don't know if that's quite accurate.
Thomas Cranmer was, but I mean, Hooker is defending, I mean, he's writing a defense against its Protestant critics who say you're too Catholic, and his answer is no. We also use scripture, not just tradition, and we use reason, by which he meant experience as well. If you're Methodist, you say scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. And I might have mentioned this, that's because John Wesley was a romantic. So during the period of Romanticism, experience was considered something different from reason, like feeling different from reason, but Hooker incorporated experience within reason. That matters a lot in the last 50 years for the Episcopal Church, just to be really clear, because the question is, when we talk about, hey, what about same-sex marriage? Well, okay, we see some scriptures that arguably the context is probably different. We know what the tradition is, no, and then the real question is that reasonable? I mean, is it reasonable? I mean, I don't think so. I don't, and the church doesn't either. So if you're wondering, how is it that we have changed tradition? How is it that we've responded to scriptures, who, by the way, are pretty ambiguous, just to be honest? As an armchair Bible scholar, like, I feel really comfortable saying that. The main pillar has been reason. Why would God discriminate against people because they have the same set of genitals? That makes no sense. I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. Same reason for women in leadership. We know what the tradition is, even though the earliest tradition was women were apostles, like we know that. We know that there are ways you can read Paul that frankly aren't particularly healthy, so let's call that ambiguous. Is it reasonable that only people with like testosterone and testicles can be priests? Like, what's the reason for that? There's no reason. I mean, and that's why we changed. I hope I'm being clear about. And look, Hooker wrote this down, but he wasn't taking on those issues then. They were still too early. But this has been part of part of the change. Hey, all of our scientists tell us that the world is like 6 billion years old or older. But if I read the Bible like a literal textbook, it's only 6,000 years old. So what do? I use my reason, right? And a book of poetry might well be poetic. I mean, this is kind of how we've come to it. And the seeds come from this document of Hooker saying, look, you know, like our minds are created by God, and so is investigation. And this is what he's telling Protestants, low Protestants who are like, there should be no art in churches. Like, is that reasonable? By the way, traditionally there was art in churches, right? Well, God didn't want images in the temple, except it was covered with images. Have you read what the thing looked like? Like covered with images, right? And so like as I've mentioned before, the Episcopal Church and the Roman Church, they believe in beauty for its own sake. Still, like the theology of aesthetics comes from the Catholic tradition, and we've maintained it. We think it's reasonable. It's traditional. We also find it to be biblical, right? So again, this is the three-legged stool of Hooker.
Was Hooker a priest?
Yes, and an Anglican, but mostly he was the kind. I mean, this is a good thing to remember what priests did back in the day. Not much. They did a service here and then they had a lot of leisure time and a pension, because when you paid taxes to the government, part of that went to paying the clergy. I mean, that's fading in Europe, but that still is the case in many European countries, that you pay taxes to the state to support the local church. And so, what do you know, like some priests had a lot of leisure time and they came up with some really interesting theorems for like calculus and economics, because, well, they didn't have to work, right? I mean, they sort of preached and they might have visited people in the village, but they weren't doing that 10 hours a day or anything, right? I mean, they were kind of like this lesser category of gentry who had been formally educated and were curious. Like Bayes, I don't know if any of you took statistics, but there's Bayes' theorem. That was an Anglican clergyman that came up with that.
Well, weren't a lot of them second sons as well?
Also second sons. But their dads didn't have to pay for their livelihood. That was state supported. So when Henry took over the church, he got all the land. He got all the Catholic land, now belonged to the crown. By the way, he squandered it really quickly in a war with France. But he there was immense wealth that Henry got out of this, and there was still some of that income stream flowing to the crown. Okay. I don't know what else I want to say about the 1600s. And maybe we want to leave Europe and not like go sequentially, but just try to catch us up a little bit here in the States. I don't know. I want to follow your interest and not overly bore you here.
I had a question about that Anabaptist movement.
Oh, yeah.
For years, I thought it was anti-Baptist.
Oh, no. Anna means again.
Again.
Yeah. So they wanted a second baptism that they believed would be legitimate. It was done by immersion. It was done for adults only. And essentially what they were saying is the practice of christening or the practice of infant baptism wasn't valid.
Because it was too early.
And they didn't immerse, and it wasn't for an adult. And there was some corruption in the apostolic succession. Right, so maybe maybe the clergy like didn't have the powers they thought they had. And Anabaptists were pretty easy to eliminate because they were pacifists, by and large, except for the Kingdom of Munster, which we talked about briefly last time. Okay, so in the American frontier, we've got the colonies, right? They're all doing okay. Anglicans are the ones who are doing best. Now remember, Maryland is after Bloody Mary, right? So there's Catholics here in the New World, but in general, the people with power and privilege tend to be the Anglicans. And there was this priest that came down to Georgia from England named John Wesley. Maybe you've heard of him, an Anglican priest until he died. To be really clear, he was not a Methodist. He didn't found Methodism. He was an Anglican priest. He was a circuit rider, and he was also a romantic, as I mentioned, and he had this brother who was a brilliant musician named Charles. And so what they did is they wrote a lot of, well, compelling hymns that have made it into our hymnal. Come thou fount of every blessing being one, oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing, for another, away in a manger being a third, right? The Wesley brothers worked together. They drove each other nuts. John Wesley probably would be on the spectrum today. But he wrote, I mean, he did a lot of writing. And of course, he had an expression of Anglican piety that was a little different from the norm, which ended up becoming Methodism after him. Couple interesting pearls from Wesley. He says that being ignorant is not a sin. Remaining ignorant is. Now that's really interesting, isn't it? If you sin in ignorance, that's a non sequitur, because being ignorant is not a sin. I mean, that's a bit lovely, really, to think through, right? That, hey, sometimes we get worried about things we did when we didn't know better, and Wesley's like, yeah, but you didn't know better.
Yeah.
So this is thoughtful, right? By the way, there's a reputation that Methodists don't drink alcohol, but that had nothing to do with John Wesley. That came around later. It came around later when, frankly, there was a lot of public drunkenness, and people were seeing, and you probably know this story. I don't know if it happens less now than it did, but factory workers would get paid, and on the way home, they'd spend all their wages on the drink, and they'd get home and their families were starving, right? And so this was a major concern. Wesley was concerned about alcohol abuse. He was, but there wasn't a solution to this until the 1850s, when these Methodist guys with the name of Welch discovered that you could pasteurize grape juice and it wouldn't ferment. What do you know? The juice still has their name. And so this is the Welch's pasteurized grape juice to prevent people from getting drunk in church, to prevent supporting alcohol when they saw how dissolute behavior with alcohol was affecting families. So to this day, the Methodists tend to drink at home. Although there are some Methodist churches, right, that will offer you your choice. Some you can intinct in the wine. They don't quite do the common cup, so you can dip, or you can dip in the grape juice, or maybe have your own little shot glass of Welch's. Yeah, and again, this is like the brand name is important because they're the ones who invented pasteurization. I mentioned that the Methodists added experience, and the other thing that's interesting to know about the Methodists is that their form of church polity is more like the Anglican Church than it is like the Episcopal Church. So in the Methodist Church, they don't call them priests. Elders are assigned by their bishop, and they're supposed to have an itinerancy system because John Wesley himself kind of rode around preaching at revivals. And you're not supposed to be in a church more than 3 to 5 years. And then you're supposed to get moved for the sake of clean ideas, like different perspective on the scriptures. The way it works now is if the church has enough members and money, they keep their clergy as long as they want. But this itinerancy system is like the Church of England, where vicars are appointed by bishops and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is appointed by the Queen. It is unlike the Episcopal Church because rectors have tenure, and we vote and elect our bishops. They're not appointed. So this is an interesting thing that happens in the States, right? And it really happens when we have that little disagreement about self-governance, is that everybody's Anglican. We're praying for the king. We have the king's form of government in church and state, but now we're having a revolution. So what do? And one of the most ardent people against the American Revolution, if you've seen Hamilton, is Samuel Seabury, who was our first bishop in the Episcopal Church. was very against it. And then when we did, it was like, well, okay, I guess I'll support it now. So what happened, and this is where the Episcopal Church starts to become very different from the Anglican Church, is over the American Revolution. We need a different prayer book because we can't pray for the king like we overthrew the king. And I didn't tell you, right, that after the Orange Revolution, there weren't really like great candidates for the monarchy, since they brought in these German guys, the Hanoverian. At one point, all the monarchs in Europe were related to each other because the English throne was controlled by Germans, right? And King George I, who used to sit apparently in a pot of mashed potatoes and put them on his head. Anyway, he's the one who lost us, right? And it wasn't for lack of trying, and we weren't going to pray for him anymore. And there was this major problem. So we want to like keep the Anglican tradition, but we need a different prayer book, and we need priests and bishops. And we sent some folks over to England and said, hey, Samuel Seabury, we've elected him to be our first bishop. Once you consecrate him, you need a bishop to make a bishop. And the Anglican Church said, no thanks. We won't be consecrating you bishop until you swear an oath of fealty to the king. Well, that was a non-starter, right? So there was a major crisis, and we almost didn't end up with an Episcopal Church because you need a bishop to make a bishop. So luckily, the Church of Scotland reached out to Samuel Seabury on his trip and said, well, let's have a conversation about us consecrating you bishop. And they did. With the understanding that in the new American prayer book, we would not use the Anglican rite at the Eucharist, we would use the Scottish rite. So I know you've heard of the Scottish rite. It's like people who wear those green turbans and drive go-karts and stuff. And that is a thing now, but the Scottish rite actually is the Mass. And as a result, the differences are, a quick summary is that the Scottish rite is closer to the Roman Catholic Missal than to the Anglican rite. The Anglican rite talks about a table and being nourished. The Scottish rite talks about an altar and sacrifice and satisfaction. So when you hear Eucharistic Prayer 1, it's because it's from the Scottish rite. Which is, by the way, why we have the cross of St. Andrew and the Episcopal shield. That's the X, the cross of St. Andrew from Scotland. So Samuel Seabury comes back. He writes the first prayer book for, well, the former colonies, and gets that done in 1787, and it lasts a good 100 years. So we do get our own prayer book where we pray for the members of Congress, the justices of the Supreme Court, right? That's been in the prayer book for a long ago. And we also get this different system where the presiding bishop is elected by the governors. The governors are the other bishops, right? So they elect the presiding bishop, who's like the executive branch, except the presiding bishop can't tell any of them what to do. There's a very federalist system, actually. There's two kinds of priests. There's rectors who have tenure, cannot be moved, are called by their own people who pay their own salary. And then there are vicars who can be moved by the bishop at the bishop's whim. So if you're wondering what's the difference between a vicar and a rector, that's it. What's the difference between a parish and a mission? Parishes have rectors, missions have vicars.
What about a curate?
A curate is a new priest who does not exist canonically. So they have like no canonical rights. Neither does an associate rector exist canonically. They serve at the pleasure of the rector, not the bishop. And the idea of a curate is that you've just trained somebody to be a priest, and boy, some on-the-job training would be real helpful. So curates are priests, or they're becoming priests. We had a curate who came to us as a deacon, was priested in place, but the goal was that she was going to get real-world opportunity with mentorship, and that we would also benefit from her ministry at the same time. This diocese has curates because this diocese has money. Our last diocese that I came from had no money, we had no curates. So I was an associate rector, never a curate. The diocese was not involved in paying me at all. But in some ways I was a curate because I had like a great mentorship. And I did my own things there. So it was like a win-win-win.
The Episcopal Church outside of the United States,
Like in Haiti or in Taiwan.
how, they don't have a Congress or?
They come to the General Convention. Yeah, so the biggest democratic gathering in the world is the General Convention of the Episcopal Church. Every 3 years, like 10,000 people come and they all have voice and vote. I mean, it's huge. By the way, this is like helped form the American government. It's bicameral house. There's the House of Bishops, and then there's the House of Deputies, which is comprised of both lay people and clergy in strict proportion. Right, so checks and balances. The House of Bishops can't pass constitutional or canonical changes without the House of Deputies. How do you manage 10,000 people? Well, you get 2 minutes at the microphone and then it turns off. You can keep talking if you want to, but no one will hear you. 2 minutes or less. They're pretty great, actually. They're pretty interesting to see.
Is there a large Episcopal population outside of the United States?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, like Haiti, most people in Haiti are Episcopalians. Taiwan, the Philippines is made of both Episcopalians and Roman Catholics, right? But those are just a few examples. American Samoa, right? Like 17 countries comprise the Episcopal Church, and they have bishops, and those bishops, like the Bishop of Taiwan, goes to the House of Bishops meetings, which are sometimes in Taiwan. That's an expensive year when we send our bishops over there to Taiwan, but that's the thing. Yeah.
Long Island, we had a lot of Caribbean parishes that came up, so, all Black congregations.
And some of them are Anglican, and some of them are Episcopalian. Right, and here that we're in communion with the Anglicans, but we have a different prayer book, and we have a different system of government. But a lot of the other stuff is similar. So all of this is getting developed, and what do you know, like there's been more Episcopal presidents than any other denomination. So we tend to be a relatively small numeric denomination, but historically we've had a lot of power. Sometimes we've used that really well, and sometimes it's been really ugly, as with all power, right?
What's the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the Archbishop of Canterbury?
The Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of the Anglican Communion, well, just beneath the monarch. So the head of the Church of England is King Charles. But the Archbishop of Canterbury, who right now is Justin Welby, serves at the pleasure of the king and sort of runs most of the church. The Archbishop of Canterbury is therefore the head of the Anglican Communion. So there is an Anglican version of Christianity in New Zealand, which has its own prayer book, but is still in the Anglican Communion. That's the same with South Africa and Rwanda and a number of other countries that have their own prayer book, but are in the Anglican Communion. What does that mean to be in the communion? That means if I were moving to England, I would have an interview and I could just get right in if they found me fit for service. I'm already a priest here, so like my priesthood transfers, if that makes sense. However, the Archbishop of Canterbury, like, wow, a representative figure for us, cannot tell us what to do. But because he represents the Anglican Communion, it's probably worth hearing him out, if that makes sense. Yeah, so that's kind of the deal. I mean, and we do go to the Lambeth week. Bishops go to the Lambeth conference. I think it's every 7 years. Lambeth is where the Archbishop's palace is. Yeah, bishops have palaces, right? They go down to Galveston. You can see it's in England. Yeah, so it's like a long conference, and all the bishops in the Anglican Communion are invited, and that's a lot. And there's a lot of obviously multi-ethnic, and increasingly numbers of women are represented. And like you can just look at the photos of those. Yeah. I know I just got us to the revolution and look, we've had a basic American history course probably where there's other things going on. Like there's this little tiny place called Rhode Island where this guy called Roger Williams, alongside someone who doesn't get enough credit, Ann Hutchison, said, hey, we really should have a place where I want you to hear how non-puritanical this is, where people can practice their faith in peace. Right. And Roger Williams and Ann Hutchison alike believed strongly in a separation of church and state, because they saw what happens when ecclesial powers are dominated by national powers. We'd like to think we believe in a separation of church and state, but we don't, in fact, because I can sign your civil marriage license as an agent of the state. That is very weird. I wish it were not so, but that is a holdover of combined church and state. By the way, I cannot dissolve your marriage. You have to go to court for that. So I can make it, but can't unmake it. And of course, what's really interesting is that who was Roger Williams most concerned with were Baptists, even though he excoriated them for their theology. I mean, it seems like Roger Williams was more likely a Quaker, and no one liked Quakers, to be really clear. Like nobody liked them. I'll tell you why in a second. But he provided that Baptists should have a place to play out their silly faith in peace. I mean, this was essentially Roger Williams' gift. What's curious is Baptists went from having like no political power at all, none, like they needed someone to stick up for them just to meet, to now trying to co-opt one of our two national parties. It's very strange, right? Because they can, which is a sad thing, right? The separation of church and state benefited their existence, and now there's been an intentional move to co-opt it.
So Roger Williams was concerned with the Baptist safety and freedom.
As a representative group, well, you know, he also thought that Jewish people should be allowed to have synagogues and not be persecuted. And that was not normal thinking. And still, like, what do we do with Jewish folks? I mean, the jury was out, but Roger Williams believed in at least toleration. I don't know about respect, but he believed in toleration. And Ann Hutchison as well. Again, her voice tends to get lost because she's a female, but she's a thoughtful one. Okay, the Quakers, they showed up during the early Reformation, and what was the problem with the Quakers? And you probably know George Fox was one of like people who gets credit for the Quakers. And he talked about how we all have an inner light. And since we all have an inner light, like we don't need clergy, because who are they to tell us what to do? So Quakers are pacifists, radical abolitionists in the States, radical abolitionists. And they didn't like to recognize social class because that was like acting like some people had more light than others, and that patently was false in their theology, which their theology is not wrong, right? And the big issue, I know I've said this to you a few times, in Rite 1, we use the Lord be with you and with thy spirit. Well, we think that's old-fashioned and formal. That's actually second person intimate. This is like the du form in German. And why don't we use it anymore? Because the Quakers started calling everybody by intimate. Because they said, look, we're children of God. We all have the intimate, this inner light. So let's just treat each other like siblings. And people are like, that really threatens the social hierarchy. So this is where thy, thee, thou dropped from the English language in favor of the formal you. So this is intimate. Now we use it as formality. You is formal. Now we consider that intimate. That's so weird, isn't it?
Yes.
Of course, you know, Pennsylvania got the Quakers because it didn't seem all that desirable at the time, right? So just give them that land. This is sort of how this stuff works out. A couple other interesting facts about the New World I think I shared with you. The Queen of England, Elizabeth, gave a particular parish, well, a pretty big land grant in Manhattan. So Trinity Wall Street owns most of the island. Did I tell you this already?
Mm-mm.
Trinity Wall Street is the wealthiest, like, single parish in the world because it owns most of Manhattan, like Columbia University, which used to be King's College. The land is owned by that one church. I mean, I guess technically it's owned by the diocese, but it was a land grant to Trinity Wall Street, who also owns the New York Stock Exchange. So the rents that come to the parish make it exceedingly wealthy, and Elizabeth gave that to that one particular parish. I mean, there's just sort of funny things like that.
Where is this parish again?
Trinity Wall Street, it's on Manhattan,
Oh, well,
Yeah. Downtown.
down the street from the New York Stock Exchange. It's on Wall Street. Yeah, it's not a big church.
Yeah.
Like
it's not.
it's like the size of ours. And if you go to a service there, there's like not a lot of people going to that service. But I mean, your pledge is pretty irrelevant at that place.
You heard a lot about it during 9/11. It was right there, and St. Paul's Chapel, which is actually part of Trinity, was a staging area for the recovery.
Yeah. They do some generous stuff, and they spend their money on education that is like pretty top notch, right? They do these conferences that are pretty amazing. I mean, they don't have to work very hard.
Well worth a visit if you're ever.
Yeah, it's definitely well worth a visit. They have some beautiful art in there too. Of course,
That and St. Paul's Chapel.
yeah, but I would also say that St. Thomas in New York is worth a visit
Oh, yeah.
too.
Well, St. Thomas and St. Mary's Midtown.
Smoky
Smoky
Mary's, yeah.
Smoky Mary's.
That's an Anglo-Catholic parish, Smoky Mary's is, yeah. We weren't talking about Anglo-Catholicism in here, we were talking about it in confirmation class. And this is maybe a good thing to know. I know I'm really like spending some time on the Episcopal tradition for a second here. There's a lot of variety in the Episcopal Church that we often don't realize, because like, I don't think there's an Anglo-Catholic parish in the diocese nearby. Anglo-Catholicism has like high, it's not like they have a liturgy. We have a liturgy. I mean, every church has a liturgy, but there is this attachment to ceremony. I don't want to say tradition. I want to say a particular type of tradition is what you could expect. So like, I don't know if you've been to an Episcopal church in which you say the Hail Mary after the Mass. That's probably going to be an Anglo-Catholic parish. Or perhaps when the priest holds, and by the way, the priest will only be male in general. This is changing a little bit, but this has been the tradition in Anglo-Catholicism, that when the priest says the Mass, not the Eucharist, right? Says the Mass, it's another signifier. When they hold up the bread, they might genuflect 3 times. Ooh, that's hard on the quads, right? Same with the chalice, and try not to spill it while you do it. And clergy get one type of bread, and lay people get another type of bread. And the priest will go to the credence table to switch as they do it. I mean, never mind how long it takes. They do the dishes in front of you, right? So that you do all of the ablutions on the Lord's table, like that's part of it. You might see acolytes come out and like hold the chasuble out so it's in all of its glory. Yeah, you'll see smoke, of course, and not mirrors, but bells. There'll be lots of chimes, right? And so this is like a little bit of what Anglo-Catholicism looks like. Yeah.
Where is this?
Well, I can tell you where in Houston there is one. We had one in San Diego. We actually had 2. We had 2 Anglo-Catholic parishes out of 42, and people would drive 40 minutes to get there because that was their piety. Like, they weren't going to the neighborhood church. They were going to the Anglo-Catholic parish because that was like important to them. I'm not putting it down. I'm saying there's a lot of variety that we don't often realize. Sometimes there are rood screens. A rood screen, reminder, was like this thing that kind of semi blocks your view of the chancel area. I mean, we mostly don't have those because sometimes we find them rude, R-U-D-E. But there is a tradition of rood screens, right? We don't have one. I'm going to be really clear. We don't have a rood screen. You can see everything happening.
A lot of the Anglo-Catholic parishes split off back when the priests and the prayer book was changed back
In 1976.
in 76 and 78.
Yeah.
Because they were really upset about all that. 'Cause I originally started in an Anglo-Catholic parish. They separated into multiple separate things, and they've kind of come back together a little bit.
Yeah.
But they formed, one of them that I was familiar with was literally the Anglican Catholic Church, is how they characterize themselves.
We lived in Northwest Indiana, and when we first moved there, I thought I had been dumped into I don't know where. I went to the Episcopal church, but it was all the bells and smells, and
Mhm.
they swing that incense all around all the time, and the bell ringing, and there were a lot of, I call them Catholic things that were in the church that I wasn't used to, and I didn't know what the heck was going on. I didn't know where I was. I mean, I knew I was in the Episcopal church, but it wasn't one that I was used to, and I didn't know they did all that in the Episcopal church.
Yeah, but-
It was an education.
But then I went to a Rite One church, keep in mind,
Yeah.
Rite One feels antiquated, and they had a praise and worship band with smoke and lasers. But they were using Rite One. It was so jarring that we were singing contemporary Christian songs. That means they're from the 70s. Let's just be honest, that's what it means, right? So we were doing that, but then we had Rite One. I mean, it was it was so
What's going
bizarre,
on?
but that's all over.
When I was doing some research in the Florida area, there was one church that was a branch, Episcopal church, that was a branch of the Jesus movement.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
I've never heard of that.
Well, part of why we have so much variety, though, has to do with our government and our respect for local custom and the parish's ability to have actually, well, some thinking. It is all because of our polity, what the priest allows. But good luck telling your people who love a thing, they can't love that thing anymore, right? I mean, really, good luck.
yeah.
That will be miserable for both of you. Okay, so we do have tremendous variety, but part of it comes back not only to Elizabeth, but also to the way the government is set up, where different dioceses have different ethos depending on who their bishop is and who their previous bishop was, right? So just want to offer that.
The Anglican church that's up here on Space Center. How's that different?
Is it the Anglican Church of North America, ACNA?
Yeah,
One of the splinter groups.
It's a splinter group that is not in communion with the Anglican Church. So this is really confusing. They call themselves the Anglican Church of North America, but they're not in the Anglican communion. We are, they're not. What did they split over? Women in ministry, and I'm not even going to say celebration. I'm going to say tolerance of same-sex relationships. Tolerance. And who are their bishops? Bishops in Rwanda. Now, I know this is going to sound really, really harsh, right? You prefer female genital mutilation and polygamy to consenting adult behavior. I can't understand it. I'm not calling my colleagues out or people who worship there, but structurally, that's bizarre to me. Your overseeing bishop is somebody in Africa who is 15,000 miles away. What kind of oversight are they going to offer? They don't even speak your language. But you've asked them to oversee you so you can have theology you want, so you can get your way, instead of having to deal with a larger group of people who says, we've considered your opinion and we've still decided to do this. It is a very tragic way that we make decisions. I didn't get what I want, so you're all wrong, and I'll start my own.
I don't think they think it through that.
I know, that's why,
Yeah.
this is me on the outside thinking it through.
The issue is that, they're very strict about what they think is right, which is very characteristic of a lot of evangelicals and other folks I know. But, they have certainty about certain things. And, they'll do what they have to do. It's important for them to have the apostolic succession. So they've got to have a bishop somewhere.
Yeah.
But they don't really care where it is and who it is.
As long as they can have
expect
their cultural values, which aren't even theological ones.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting thing.
Mhm.
So I sound like I'm putting those people down. I'm putting down the structure of it because it is very sad. The people who worship there are people like you and I, right? The people who are clergy there are people who are like you and I, right? I mean, they're not worse, they're not dumb, but the structure is just, it's confusing because the precedent of that is tough. I mean, you realize that the Baptist denomination has more than 108 officially recognized types. So you probably know about the Southern Baptist, maybe you've heard about the American Baptist. By the way, they split over slavery, in case you want to know. The Southern ones wanted to keep their slaves. The Northern ones said, let's not do that. Those are the American ones now, right?
Oh, they changed to American from Northern?
Well, yeah,
Just to,
after the Civil War.
Yeah.
But the Southern stayed Southern.
yeah.
And they ended up coming out against slavery after some time. I mean, after it had been like made illegal and there was social pressure to change, right? I mean, this is part of it, but you just know about those two. There's also Foursquare and there's Foursquare Full Gospel. I mean, it just continues, right? And here's a story, and I know, look, I mean, there's things I'd split over too. They're just different ones, I guess. I mean, I would split if women couldn't be in ministry. I probably would split over that, right? So maybe I should just out myself. But I used to live in Atlanta, and up the vacation area was, instead of Lake Travis, it was Lake Lanier. And a lot of people went up to Lake Lanier. And there's 3 Baptist churches within a mile. And the first one was called Hope Baptist Church. And the second one was called New Hope Baptist Church. And the third one was called Real Hope Baptist Church. And it's pretty clear what happened. By the way, Lake Lanier is really small, right?
That's a real thing, because I always thought that was an apocryphal story, because I've heard that kind of story.
It's a real thing.
I-
Well,
I've
per one of-
actually seen the churches. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't visited the 3 places, I haven't, but my professor, who I trust to not make things up, shared this story with me, and he lived in Lake Lanier, so I'll give him credit for it. And the truth is, it doesn't even have to be factually be true.
I had no, this is so different for me. I had no idea there were that many different
Yeah, well, I think,
Protestant churches.
oh yeah, and there's a lot more to it.
Well, because,
That we don't know about.
and it's interesting, it's like, well, I can see why somebody would split when it becomes cumbersome, right? But like, boy, it's cumbersome whether you have a piano or not, yes. I mean, that's what differentiates the Christian church and the disciples of Christ from the Church of Christ, is the piano.
Mhm.
So if you're a member of the Church of Christ, you sing everything a cappella.
And they do sing well.
It's beautiful, and they read music fantastically, right? I mean, like, you want to go
If you
to,
don't sing well, you're encouraged to not sing.
that's right.
It's true.
And not putting those folks down, but like that whole doctrine against the piano comes from one verse of the Psalms, right? Which is, but then there's all these other Psalms that talk about playing with a skilled hand. So it's like this really interesting thing that we all do. And because I'm not in that group, because I'm not in that group, I can say how silly of them, right? Don't call me out on my silliness, though, please. But this is what we do. We since the Reformations, there has been increasing splintering denominationally. I mean, there has. And there's been some moments where we try to get back together, like the Methodist Church became the United Methodist Church. And then what do you know, now there's the Divided Methodist Church because they split over same-sex relationships. Well, they don't want to go by that. So if you're not in the United Methodist Church, now you're a global Methodist. Because in the rest of the globe, you hate gay people. I mean, I don't know what else to say. Like, that's a sad descriptor, right? And that's how we do things. Particularly in America. Now look, if you're Catholic, this is a really interesting thing. If you're Catholic, I don't know how you build Catholic loyalty, but they do, right? I mean, I know a lot of Catholics that are like, God, I hate the Catholic Church. I mean, priests should be able to marry. I take birth control. I've been divorced. I'm like, well, you know, like, you could come to the Episcopal Church. Yeah, I'm Catholic. But there's this intense loyalty. Like, I may hate everything, but I'm Catholic. Like, this
As a
thing.
Catholic, I fully understand that. I just understand it. I don't know what it is about it, but it is weird.
I'm not even saying it's bad. I'm saying, like,
I just,
I don't know any other church that does it that well.
And I come I've come to your church.
Well, I mean, a couple other people have, and they've been very slow. It's like I'm giving up a part of myself to do this. Whereas like, if I don't like the priest, I'll go to the Baptist church if I like that person. I mean, like but there is this like intense Catholic loyalty that Protestants don't have, and consider why. There's one Catholic church and there's a million Protestant churches.
Well, the Catholics also tell kids from day one that you're going to hell if you leave the Catholic.
I guess that's the thing too. And if you get married, you've made a vow that you'll raise your children Catholic, even if you're
I
not.
was never told that. And I went to Catholic school for 8 years.
Yeah.
And my family was Catholic, we're Hispanic, very Catholic, but no one has ever said that to
I
us.
was told that in Catholic school every day.
Every day. Wow.
Pretty close.
Where
I
the-
mean, it was emphasized.
Where
that-
were you? Here in Texas?
Yeah. In Houston.
That just seems
Yeah.
shocking to me because
Yeah.
it wasn't my experience.
The thing that impresses me is they have such an enormous sense of community. I have a really good friend who's in Vegas, and I go, he's very devout. I'm sure he goes to mass every week, and I go with him occasionally. I mean, the Catholic Church is enormous. I mean, it's just, easily competes with the mega churches here, easily.
Yeah.
And it's really impressive
Well,
how well they do that.
and I'm not, this isn't critical, but like if you're Catholic, you have to go to church.
Yes.
If you're Protestant, it might be nice for you, right? I mean, but if you don't go to church, you're not getting the sacrament, and that might put your soul in jeopardy, right? Like, so again, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying that's a different approach. See, once you take sacramentality off the table, then church is a luxury, not a necessity. And we just have to be honest about that, right? I mean, and I'll tell you as your priest, God doesn't need you to go to church. I fully
guess that-
believe that.
I guess that's part of what has the pull, that the sacrament is so important, you have to go.
You have
You
to go.
don't get it. I mean, and I got that some in my Anglo-Catholic parish.
Yeah.
That was a really important thing to do every Sunday, if you could possibly do it.
Because it's good for your soul.
Yes.
Not, it might be good for my soul if I'm in the right mood and I have the right intentions, right? I mean, and that goes all the way back to the Reformation. This is how we split out sacramentality.
It's good for your soul. Don't be not.
I mean, ultimately, I tell you, it is good for your soul, whether you think it is or not. Like, I would say that. But I would also say that God doesn't need you to have it, which makes me different from the Roman Catholic. I would say it's beneficial to you. God doesn't need you to do it. I know that's like hair splitting, but that's what we split over. We split over hair splitting.
I believe that, what you're saying. I don't believe that God needs that.
Now, official Catholic doctrine says,
Yeah, I know that.
yeah, okay, all right.
What surprised me when we were up in Northwest Indiana was how many different kinds of Catholic churches there were. Of course, the Roman church was near us, but then there was a Byzantine one, and then there was I can't remember what, it was like a country, a Ukrainian or something, Catholic church. And then there was a Polish Catholic church on the other side of the highway. And then, of course, further down, there was a Greek Orthodox and then a Serbian Orthodox. And I don't even know what that was, but I mean, I think they were the Eastern, ones that followed a different calendar.
There's
Yeah.
probably only one or two of those that's actually Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I
They're
don't.
strict
know what they
about it.
were.
You're
but it
within the
was-
geographic area of your parish. That's where you go.
I mean, they were all very close. I could have walked to 3 of them. I mean, easily. They weren't far. And I was like, what the heck is this?
Yeah.
I didn't know, what are all these, like, what's the difference? I didn't know. Well, I think the Polish one, everything was in Polish.
Right. Well, I want to talk about some more of the differences next week, actually, but I would say this is changing what Tim said, because there's many people I know who are Catholic in this neighborhood who drive to St. Mary's because they don't want to go to St. Paul's. And that's a recent development within Catholicism. Yeah. Depends on whether or not they like the clergy
Yeah.
or the style of worship. It's a very Protestant thing to say,
Yeah.
but I'm hearing it. Yeah, I'm hearing it. So I think it's changing. And I don't think it's changing worldwide. I think it's changing in the United States first. because that's how Protestants act, right? That is what we do. Okay, so next time, next week, we'll talk more about some more of these splinter groups and why they splintered and a bit more about their history, if that's okay.
You know,